Hi, everyone. So here I am in K360, and no one else is here. So I think maybe I should ask you to vote on whether or not we should meet face to face, because you know, I've come up here with my computer, which it's okay to get out of my office every once in a while, but I don't know if the Wi-Fi connection is as good as the landline. So because some of you are still not able to hear me, it says connecting to audio. And so I'm wondering if it might be because the landline is a little bit slow. But, and so hopefully that will be fixed. So, okay, yeah, so, yeah, there, some of the Subin Jew is still trying to access the audio. So, just can't, anyway, well, I have to wait and see what happens. But, okay, well, I guess let's move forward. All right, so you're foreign policy. And as I told the European Union policymaking class, I'm a little bit feeling a little unusual today because I attended a Zoom conference this past weekend over 3 days, and each time the conference started at 11 o'clock at night my time and continued until until 8 o'clock in the morning. And so, Subin Ju, can you hear me? I think everybody else is able to access me. I don't know what the issue is with Subin Ju. Everybody else seems to be able to access me. So hopefully she can get that fixed. So we have a debate coming up on Friday, and it's going to be me as Khan with Sumun on two South Koreans. The Republic of Korea will face increasing pressure to choose between the US or China as the primary focus of its international trade cooperation. And yeah, I don't know what the issue is with Subin Ju. It's strange. So that will be on Friday, and we have, of course, a paragraph due by Wednesday on this topic, and so you will submit that by Wednesday, and that way comment and send it back to you. And if this is an issue, if there are technical problems, I don't know why she is unable to. I'm going to send her a chat message. And let's see what she says. So before I forget, let's do the smart attendance sign in. And so we go to Cyber Campus and screen share. And so the sign in smart attendance will be under week 13, smart attendance, and your number is 326. 326 is your smart attendance number. And I think Subin Ju is now able to access me. Good. Yeah, that took a long time. I'm kind of surprised that took that long for her to be able to access the audio. So that might be the Wi-Fi that I'm using here on my laptop in room K360. I think I might be the only professor who goes to the classroom. But anyway, so I'll figure out what we're going to do about that in the future, since we just have a couple weeks left in the semester. So back to our class here, and to the lesson plan, and stop share and screen share. And I tell you, I'm also disturbed by another reason. On Friday, I went home early because I had to get up. I had to do laundry, and I had to get up early and attend the conference I was telling you about. It started 11 o'clock at night. So I did laundry, went to bed to get a few hours sleep because I would beat up all night. And I came in on Saturday to my office, and there was all this coupon food outside of my door. And I thought somebody bought me a gift for a celebration. So I put it in my office and I started eating it. And then I got a message just now posted on my door telling me that somebody had the coupon had mistakenly delivered that food to my office. So, but I opened it up and started eating it. So I'm going to have to offer to pay for that food because it went to my office by mistake. I just thought somebody ordered me a gift for some reason. But anyway, so that's unusual. So let me open up the notes for this week. And economic statecraft are the notes. And so far, it looks like it's still screen sharing. And trade policy and economic statecraft is very important because for a lot of reasons, obviously. Another reason being, of course, that in the era of nuclear weapons, using deadly force has become much more dangerous for everybody involved, including the nuclear powers. So they are more likely to use coercion in the form of economic coercion and economic incentives, positive and negative, to promote a country's interests and foreign policy aims. So, when I was your age a long time ago, in the early 1980s, when I was in college, there was a distinction made between what was called high politics and low politics, high international relations and low international relations. And high politics was the international relations of diplomacy involving particularly threatened use of force, security diplomacy, national security policy, and so on. And low policy focused on trade negotiations. I think nobody uses that distinction anymore in discussing international relations and foreign policy, because economic capability, economic development is so important for a country's power capabilities, particularly now that the Soviet Union has disappeared. If you want to be a strong, powerful country, and that means you have to be a developed country. And if you want to be a developed country, you have to engage in international trade and commerce with the rest of the world, like China does. Like China engaged in its economic miracle after the Koreans did and after the Japanese did by exploiting the international capitalist economy in order to develop. So it makes no sense to differentiate between economic foreign policy and national security foreign policy, because they're so closely interrelated. And particularly if you take a broad view of the role of international interdependency, including economic interdependency among countries, that would include, for example, the challenges of climate change and, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Lots of media speculation highlights that with the rapid economic development of China and the rest of the world, that there is more and more direct human impact and interaction with the few areas of the world that are still wild and native forest, original forest areas where native species that live, and human beings are exploiting more and more of those resources and coming into closer and closer contact on a dense scale, on a dense human population scale with wild creatures. And it's inevitable that we're going to have more and more of these transmissions of diseases, of viruses moving from animals to humans, zoonotic diseases. And it's happening now. It happened in the past. It happened more than once under the Obama administration, and it will happen soon again in the future. And that's a consequence of the economic development of the world and the interdependence that we all experience, whether or not we like it or not, from that economic interdependence. So, so that's a good introduction to the role of economic statecraft. It's also important in terms of what United States is doing under Trump right now as he attempts to leave office while reducing the ability of Joe Biden and the Biden incoming administration in terms of doing or adopting policies that it wishes to adopt. It notes here, this is from just a couple of days ago. Oh no, this is from a year ago, right? This is a year old, but it's important because it highlights what we've been describing. President Trump's increasing reliance on economic sanctions to solve foreign policy problems is fueling concern the United States is abusing its financial power and prompting some governments to seek ways to evade American measures. So this report goes on highlighting how the United States, because it dominates the world financial system, is able to use its dominance of the world financial system to, in effect, impose tremendous costs and pressures, not just on the governments of Iran and Venezuela, but on the people. I mean, when you put economic sanctions on North Korea or on Iran.
Professor?
Yes.
Professor, sorry, but the screen share is still connecting, so we cannot see the screen.
Okay, you know what I'm going to do? I don't know why that's happening. I'm going to move down to my office, okay? So I'm going to leave room 360 and I'm going to walk with my laptop back down to my office where I have a landline. And the landline is perhaps more secure and is more able to deal with the traffic than my computer using Wi-Fi. So I'm going to move back down to the my office and plug it in to my landline office line. And I guess this means that we won't be meeting here in room 360 unless the university tells us to, like, because the policy is right now that you have the choice about whether or not you want to come to the university. And you do not have to come because of the pandemic, but I'm supposed to make that option available to you if you want to come, but nobody wants to come. So, it's easier to use the laptop if only one or very few people come to the class. So let me go back down to my office where I have a landline, and I think that's what we will do from now on, that we will just go back to 100% Zoom online classes until the university tells us that we have to meet, like we did a couple times this semester. But I don't understand. I thought Wi-Fi was pretty effective, you know. But let me move back to my office and plug the computer back in to my landline here. And just a second. So let me plug back in here. And I think you can hear me. Can you see me? You can't see me, huh?
Yeah, we can see you.
Well, you see me even though I'm not plugged in. It takes too long for the Wi-Fi to work. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the Wi-Fi and just rely on the landline. And so, okay, well, here we are back in my office. And so back to where I was here. So let me go back to what we were talking about. And I want to show the most recent news reports here. This is from just a couple days ago, so you can see that. This highlights how Donald Trump is doing lots of good things for Israel government under Benjamin Netanyahu, who was also a conservative, nationalist, populist leader of Israel, noting how the United States has moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which most of the world has refused to do because United Jerusalem, I should say, as the capital of Israel, because the eastern part of Jerusalem was occupied by the Israelis in the 1967 war. But the United States has recognized that United Jerusalem is the capital of Israel now under Trump. It's going to be very difficult for Joe Biden to reverse that. That also the United States is using economic interests and economic tools to pressure the Palestinians to acquiesce to Israel's control of all of Jerusalem and supporting Israel's move to annex more of the occupied Palestinian territories. The occupied Palestinian territories, including in the West Bank territories on the West Bank of the Jordan River that were also conquered all in the 1967 war.
Professor?
Noting that the U.S. has steadily cut off all other aid to the Palestinians, much of that going through the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. This was an agency explicitly set up right after Israel was established in 1948 to work for the relief of the Palestinian refugees that emerged in the midst of the war and ethnic cleansing that happened at this time. It was set up as one of the first United Nations agencies specifically focused on humanitarian aid and relief for the Palestinians. It doesn't work elsewhere. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which provides aid to Palestinian refugees across the Middle East.
Professor?
So the United States has cut off all funding for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. The Trump administration cut off all other aid, $200 million in support for the Palestinian Authority through the U.S. Agency for International Development. So that is the U.S. organization that was also providing aid to the Palestinians, in addition to the money that the U.S. was providing through the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. This U.S. Agency for International Development was set up in the early 1960s under the Kennedy administration, when John F. Kennedy was president, to promote American influence by promoting favorable views and opinions towards the Americans, by the Americans promoting the economic and political development of the poor, underdeveloped areas of the world through the U.S. Agency for International Development. This U.S. Agency for International Development, as I said, was created in the early 1960s along with the U.S. Peace Corps. The Peace Corps, I don't think, is active here in Korea anymore, not for many years, but it's a voluntary organization in which people volunteer to go do aid and humanitarian aid and relief work in poor countries of the world. The U.S. Agency for International Development also provided the money, much of the funding for the American University in Bulgaria, where I worked for 15 years before coming here to Korea. So the U.S. Agency for International Development is engaged in many different kinds of development projects, including establishing universities, not only in Bulgaria, but elsewhere as well. The Trump administration also cut off $60 million in aid for Palestinian security forces to develop Palestinian police and security forces, $25 million for hospitals in East Jerusalem, and $10 million for Israeli-Palestinian coexistence efforts. This was in response to the Palestinians cutting off all negotiations with the White House, with the United States, after the United States recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and also to push the Palestinians to agree that Palestinian refugees do not have the right to go back to Israel, right? The Palestinians have insisted that they have the right for their refugees who fled Israel when Israel was established in the midst of the war at the time, establishing Israel, that they have the right of return. And the United States wants the Palestinians to formally agree that they do not have the right to go back. And there are millions of those Palestinian refugees now. Of course, the Israeli demand, refusal is that, of course, Israel should be a homeland for the Jews. And if they allowed all of the Palestinian Arabs to move back to Israel who claim to be refugees, or the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters and the great-granddaughters and grandsons of refugees to move back to Israel, Israel will no longer be a majority Jewish state. The way Germany is a majority German state for Germans and Korea is a homeland for the Koreans, Israel will no longer be a homeland for the Jews if the majority of people living there are no longer Jewish. Next, the US State Department ordered the closing of the Palestinian Liberation Organization's diplomatic mission in Washington. So keep this in mind. Everybody knows how desperately they live, how poorly they live in comparison, say, to Americans or Koreans, South Koreans. And so this is increasing the misery of the population in the occupied territories, also in areas in the West, in the Gaza Strip, the other area between Egypt and Israel where millions of Palestinians live. I have a phone call. Who could this be? Yaboseo. Yeah, it says you are screen sharing. It says I'm screen sharing. So I will stop. Thank you for calling. Let me try that one more time. Okay, well, now I have learned that I cannot rely upon the, can you see it now?
No.
We cannot see it.
Professor, can you hear us?
Well, that's very strange. I mean, let me see what the problem is. Just a second, stop share. And I'm not muted. I can't. No, and I don't know why. This is the first time this has happened. Well, I mean, my speakers are, oh. No, they're not. And you know, they're not because I moved, well, it should, no, they are. Oh, I turned them off. Okay, I turned them, sorry. Okay, yeah, I forgot to turn on the speakers. Okay, so can you speak now?
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Okay, so do you have any questions?
No,
Nope.
we wanted to tell you the screen share doesn't work.
Okay, so, can you see it now?
No, still not available.
Because it says you are screen sharing. It says I'm screen sharing right now. Let me close everything here and
it works now.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so you know, these technical issues. So
It worked 5 seconds ago.
Oh, the screen share works just
okay,
before.
okay. So yeah, so
yes, we can see it now.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
now.
yeah. Okay, and then it goes on here to describe how the US is putting economic sanctions on Iran. These economic sanctions, as I said, they are causing tremendous suffering to the people of Iran, and on purpose, to try to destabilize the Iranian regime. The problem with economic sanctions is that typically they do not work. I mean, the Americans have put economic sanctions on North Korea. The North Korean government is not collapsing. The North Korean government is not destabilized. The U.S. has put tremendous amount of economic sanctions on Venezuela, and it has not caused the Maduro government in Venezuela to collapse. The problem with economic sanctions is that as people's economic well-being becomes more and more desperate, people's economic conditions within the countries that are the targets of the sanctions, as their conditions become more desperate, they become more dependent upon the authorities to keep them alive, to provide them with relief, to provide them with resources. And so these kinds of economic sanctions, like in war, end up strengthening the control of the regime that's the target of the sanctions. Because people are becoming more and more economically desperate, so they rely upon the government to provide them with aid, with handouts, with emergency food supplies. So people are concerned about not starving. They're not going to focus on protesting and fighting the government in the streets if they're trying simply to stay alive, and rely upon the government to provide them with economic aid and then economic survival packages. And then the government points to the Americans and say it's the Americans' fault. The Americans are trying to engage in imperialist intervention to control our country, and so blame the United States. So sanctions have not destabilized the Cuban government in Cuba for 60 years since Castro came to power in the Cuban Revolution. The Americans have had sanctions on Cuba forever since that time. But one of the functions of the sanctions is that it somehow makes Donald Trump supporters or any president's supporters in the United States feel like the Americans are doing something to punish America's enemies, or at least their enemies, their adversaries. And so it serves a domestic political support for the U.S. administration, because the U.S. administration is showing that it is doing something to satisfy the demands of those people that are supportive of Israel, for example, or are supportive of the opponents of Maduro in Venezuela. There have been cases where, for example, sanctions were put on Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia during the breakup of Yugoslavia, and those sanctions did contribute to the fall of the Milosevic government. But that was because the European Union was playing an active role in dealing with Serbia, and particularly Milosevic stole an election which infuriated Serbs. But typically sanctions don't really work in overthrowing a regime. Economic sanctions, they have not worked on North Korea, and they're not working on Iran, and they've not worked on Venezuela, and they've not worked on Cuba since 1960 when they were first put in place. Even though the Soviet Union, which used to support Cuba, is gone. It's been gone for almost 30 years now. So, but as I said, it does serve a domestic political function within the United States. And there are popular movements to boycott Israel and to push American companies, American corporations, and European companies and other companies in other countries around the world, companies and universities and corporations, nonprofit companies like corporations like universities, to boycott and divest and put sanctions on Israel for Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, Israel's annexation of occupied territories. We talked about this briefly in class earlier, the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement, copying or following the blueprint or the formula adopted by this movement more than 30 years ago to put sanctions on South Africa when South Africa was ruled by the white minority apartheid, white minority regime that suppressed and oppressed the Black African majority in South Africa. So there was a divestment movement among American college students, among other people, demanding that universities no longer invest in companies to acquire profits to run their university, that they divest their endowments from companies that do business in South Africa. It was called the divestment movement. Many American universities, for example, have money that they have accumulated over many years, and they invest that money in investments, and they use the profits from those investments to fund their universities, in addition to relying upon student tuition. Most universities do not rely just upon student tuition that students pay to fund those universities. They rely upon their endowment. It's called an endowment, and the endowment is invested. And so the divestment demanded that the universities of these students no longer invest in companies doing business in apartheid South Africa, or also push companies not to do business with South Africa, or else they would be punished by consumers refusing to buy their products because these companies were doing business in South Africa under its apartheid regime. So this boycott, divest, and sanctions movement borrows from an experience in putting sanctions on South Africa through a civil society effort to apply to Israel. And the Trump administration has increasingly equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is the movement to create Israel, right? So the Trump administration is arguing that somebody who is anti-Israel is anti-Semitic, hates Jews. So the Trump administration has increasingly equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, both domestically and internationally. Building on that, Pompeo this week announced that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel would be deemed anti-Semitic, and that its adherents would no longer be eligible for federal government support. So evidently, the US presidential administration can designate on its own, without congressional US Congress approval, certain groups and activities as terrorists or anti-Semitic. And so the Trump administration, in the less than 2 months it has left in office, the State Department under Mike Pompeo, he's the Secretary of State, the US Foreign Minister, is designating the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement as anti-Semitic. In other words, anti-Semitism produced Hitler, or it was a theme of the Hitler regime in Germany. So that's a very volatile statement. And so any corporation, any university that is agreeing to the demands of student activists on their university campus to withdraw their investments in companies doing business with Israel is going to become a target of the US government. The US government is going to punish any university that would do something like that, because claiming that activity is prejudiced and bigoted against Jews for being Jews. Now, again, there's only, Trump administration is only going to be in office for another, 58 days, 55 days. But still, when Joe Biden is inaugurated president on January 20th, is he going to reverse that? He will have to reverse through an executive order, an order by the US president, US executive, the president. He will have to reverse, if he wants to reverse, this movement, this designation of the BDS movement as anti-Semitic. And politically, that's going to be very, very difficult, because many, many American Jews are intensely supportive of Israel. We talked about this in class a few weeks ago, right? The boycott, divest, and sanctions movement. I think I showed you that in class in a Wikipedia entry, and I'll show it to you again if I can find it here. And so let me go to Wikipedia, and it says you're not picking this up yet. I know, I'm just trying to get to the Wikipedia site. Yeah, okay, so stop share and screen share, and this I showed you in class. This is the boycott, divest, and sanction movement, and is a Palestinian-led movement promoting boycotts, divestments, and sanctions against Israel. And so drawing upon from the experience of dealing with the apartheid South Africa and the divestment movement. So the Gaza Strip, where I think 1.7 Palestinians live in this small area here. These are the occupied territories of the West Bank of the Jordan River. This is the West Bank, this is the East Bank. And the are the areas that basically Israel de facto already controls, but Israel calls this area Judea and Samaria, the names in the Bible for this region. In other words, that this is a powerful symbol of Zionist Jewish nationalism. And U.S. has already recognized Israel's sovereignty over this occupied Golan Heights territory. In there you see Desmond Tutu. He's a religious figure in South Africa. He supported the divestment movement against apartheid South Africa, who supports also the BDS movement regarding Israel, claiming it's a new form of apartheid, that Israel is an apartheid state. This term is the South African Afrikaans policy under white South Africa, means apartness, keeping blacks and whites and other races separate. So there's a large entry here. So, and this is, fairly well developed here. And it says here, people fight over these Wikipedia entries. It says, the neutrality of this section is disputed. Relevant discussion may be found on the talk page. Please do not remove this message until conditions to do so are met. So this is just from this month. This is just designated this way. So people fight their battles, including over Wikipedia cyberspace entries. The claim is of Zionist supporters is that this is BDS movement is dangerous, not economically, but by delegitimating in the view, in the eyes of the world public, that Israel is like apartheid South Africa. And therefore it's a threat to Israel's well-being, because if the BDS movement is successful, it's undermining the legitimacy, the right of Israel to exist by equating it with the white apartheid state that was overturned in 1994 when Nelson Mandela was freed from prison, and then he ended up becoming president of South Africa, and so on. So, my question to you is, do you think, stop share, screen share. Do you think that the incoming Biden administration will renounce the Trump administration declaration of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel is anti-Semitic? So let's stop share, and I have a poll ready for you. And launch poll. So please take the poll. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
You really think that the Biden administration is going to reverse this? I mean, politically, it's going to be very difficult because of the ethnic lobby group of the Israel lobby in the United States is very, very motivated, very, very effective, very, very well organized. They see Israel as a life and death issue. Jewish Americans are predominantly vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. So I can't really tell you what I think. I mean, you have less than a minute, 4 more people. Okay, end poll. Share results. So I think I have to doubt it, because, and the Trump administration knows this. The Trump administration knows this. President Trump knows this, that Biden politically will be strongly limited in his ability to change this because of the upcoming elections in 2022. And that, again, even though Jewish Americans are only 3.5% of the vote, They're highly 3.5% of the American population, I should say, and not all of them are Zionists. Still, they are intensely motivated. In the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee is one of the many organizations that lobby on behalf of Israel in the United States, and they have their supporters among evangelical Christian Americans. So I have to say, I doubt that the Biden administration will be able to will politically change this designation. Wow. Okay, so stop sharing and back to go back to the screen. And okay, so so again, to show you that, I mean, these economic sanctions issues, both in terms of government and civil society actions, they're not only important economically, but they're important symbolically, right? Israel, the Israeli government views the BDS movement as a terrible threat because they think it undermines support for Israel around the world to the extent to which it's active. The boycott, divest, and sanction movement is active and effective. And again, because of course, that's what these people claim, that basically Israel is a Zionist version of white South African apartheid. And so we know what happened with apartheid South Africa. It no longer is in power. The regime there changed. So let me go back to the notes on economic statecraft. So this is really important, right? And make sure I'm sharing the screen, share screen. And economic prosperity requires trade and investment. For Americans and for the United States, it was founded upon people desiring a better life for themselves. Foreign economic policy is obviously been a very important part of America's involvement in international affairs before it got actively involved in military conflict in Europe directly in World War I, right? Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, remember we talked briefly about Alexis de Tocqueville, one of the most astute, skilled observers of the United States as a guest in the United States from France, noted that Americans were obsessed, even back in 1831, 1832, Americans were obsessed with earning material prosperity. That they had, I mean, think about that. That's almost 200 years ago, 190 years ago. And he's saying Americans are acting back in 1831, 1832, the way they act today. And much of the world acts today. That, oh, today, right? If I've got a smartphone, my neighbor's got to have a smartphone. If somebody else has got the newest, latest item for sale, I've got to have it. Americans were the same way 190 years ago. They were obsessed with earning material prosperity. And that includes through economics, foreign economic activity, right? And so this focus on foreign affairs has always been there, but predominantly for the first half of American history on foreign economic policy. And so regulating commerce has always been a highly political enterprise because America promotes free trade. It says, well, until Trump administration has been promoting free trade, but for the first part of America's history during the 19th century, the United States used tariffs and sanctions to protect its producers against competition from, say, Great Britain. That the United States wanted to protect its new emerging manufacturing businesses from competition with more developed and more experienced and bigger British enterprises. The economic relation to the United States were a big focus or source of controversy that led to the Civil War, because the American South wanted to sell its cotton that it raised through plantations based upon slavery to Britain so that Britain could supply its clothing, textile cloth factories. But the northern part of the United States, where there was a focus more on manufacturing, wanted tariffs and protections from British imports to protect their emerging manufacturing businesses from British competition. So this was one of the important contributors to the conflict between the North and South that led to the Civil War. Keep in mind, the Constitution of the United States is largely a product of compromise and negotiations amongst rich, powerful white men at the time, at the end of the 18th century, who having different economic interests. In the South, these rich, powerful white men often invested heavily in slavery. And in the North, even if they were not actively in owning slaves, they were still involved in businesses that were connected with rich slave plantation owners in making bank loans, for example. American banks would be involved in making loans to slave owners. So the American Constitution is largely a product of the economic interests of US constituents, which is something to keep in mind because of the tendency in American nationalism to romanticize the American Constitution as itself a powerful symbol of American national identity. American nationalism has powerful romantic symbols, including historical persons like George Washington. But the Americans, for example, don't have the big focus on their language that the Koreans do. I mean, Koreans, as you know, they have a whole holiday for the Korean Hangul alphabet and the Korean language. The Americans don't have an English language holiday because they share a language with many other English speakers, not to mention people living in Great Britain, Australia, Canada. So the language is not such a powerful source of romantic symbolism of national identity the way it is in many other places, like in Korea. But the Constitution is a powerful, powerful force itself. And it's a product of compromise, political compromise. Congress people running for re-election and presidential candidates know that economic issues are the strongest concern of voters. So we're still trying to understand why Donald Trump and the Republican Party did much better in the elections 3 weeks ago in the United States than anybody, that most people had expected, not anybody, but most people had expected that the Democratic Party under Joe Biden would do much better and the Democrats would win much more seats in the Congress than they did. But there is much speculation that Trump's refusal to support lockdowns, to encourage restrictions on economic activity might have been one of the factors why many, many people, more than were expected by elites, voted for the Republican Party because they don't want to pay an economic price for this, even though the costs are so high in terms of, for example, aside from the human suffering of people getting the coronavirus and dying, the American medical system, hospital systems may be overwhelmed so that there will no longer be spaces in hospitals for sick people because they're filled with COVID-19 patients. So aside from COVID-19 patients, if I get a heart attack, or if my family members or my friends get a heart attack in the United States, they can't go to the hospital and get treated or get adequate care because the hospitals are overwhelmed with COVID-19 patients. And that may be something that I understand and you understand, but remember I showed you that video, that funny video last week about how dumb are Americans? Most people don't pay close attention to political affairs. They don't pay attention to current events. They're not thinking about those things. They're not aware of these things. And they don't want to be aware often of those issues. They just know that I have a bar or a restaurant and they want to have a lockdown, which is going to put me out of business. How am I going to pay my bills if I can't do business? No, 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 no. So economic interest has been always a very important primary motivation for America's, you know, the American dream, right? America is the place you go to make money. America is the place you go from Korea, from Italy, from Europe, from Asia, is what the place you go to make money. And so an American president who is going to restrict making money risks paying a political price, obviously, and like anywhere, but particularly in the United States, the land of making money. So when the Cold War ended, it looked like the American way is the best way. And the Washington Consensus is the term for the promotion of by the United States, beginning with the end of the Cold War through the first Bush into the Clinton administration. This really emerged under the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton's Washington Consensus, that the world should open up to international trade markets and free up movement of capital across and financial flows across state borders. And we should emphasize balanced budgets in order to promote, in other words, what we call neoliberalism. And that was supposed to be the key for economic development and prosperity for the world. And, you know, for the longest time, there was growing economic inequality, but under the Clinton administration, there was the longest period of economic growth and prosperity until George W. Bush came into office, and there was a recession in 2001. And then the September 2001 attacks happened. And then US recovered from that. And until the pandemic, again, the longest period of macroeconomic growth in the United States ever, until the coronavirus pandemic hit, along with growing economic difference in wealth and prosperity between the richest and the poorest people in America and around the world. But also, you know, keep in mind, it was also during this time that we actually saw, under the Clinton administration in particular, a rapid decline in the number of people around the world living in extreme poverty. So there's been much criticism made of the Washington Consensus and neoliberalism, but I think I might have mentioned once before, when I was a small child in the 1960s and 70s, I remember seeing media television reports about the terrible, terrible poverty and even famine and starvation in places like Africa and elsewhere. The terrible poverty and suffering in China under Mao Zedong and his policies. And then China began to open up to the capitalist system and participate in the world capitalist market after Mao Zedong passed. And then through the 1990s, you literally saw millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people be lifted out of extreme poverty as a result of global economic prosperity and global economic development, partly through this Washington Consensus. Sure, most of the profits went disproportionately to the wealthiest people, but still you saw hundreds of millions of people be lifted out of extreme poverty thanks to global liberalization. And now we're seeing millions fall back into poverty with the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's a lot of pluses and advantages to this system. And so geoeconomics is the term that's used often to describe this political strategic focus on economics. With its geoeconomics impact has become a stronger focus with the emergence of a more integrated and regulated global economy in the world. And it's probably going to become even more strongly a focus now that we have to deal with producing, distributing the COVID-19 vaccines, and also with global climate change. These challenges and threats to global well-being can only be addressed through political strategic efforts and coordinated efforts to deal with them. And whether or not Joe Biden is going to have the flexibility to deal with them effectively to provide leadership is an ongoing question, because as I said before, Donald Trump is still the dominant actor in the US Republican Party. Even if, assuming he leaves office, he is going to be a dominant force. I think he's going to remain a dominant force in the Republican Party. So it may well be that we're going to see a more important role for China and the European Union in providing this global leadership to deal with these challenges. So China's emergence as a comparable competitor with the US has caused some to predict a decline in US power and influence away from the more unipolar world that emerged at the end of the Cold War. And that's a comment made about this coronavirus pandemic. When I read the media reports on the pandemic that began early this year, one of the themes that emerged over the months is that these kind of events tend to accelerate trends that were already in place. Like I remember using, for example, Zoom before the pandemic. It was a cute little video platform that we used every once in a while. Now the world is Zoom. I just spent 3 days on Zoom for this conference, and we're not going to go back to the old way of doing things. These international conferences, these international academic conferences I attended this past weekend and for the last 3 weeks total, I mean, they went really well. We don't need to fly to United States to meet, to have these conferences. We can save lots of money. I don't have to miss class. Like I used to when I would go to these conferences, I'd have to miss a week of class and then make them up with you somehow. I don't have to do that anymore. We're not going back to the old way of doing things. And so there was this decline in the role of the US leadership in the world in dealing with these issues. And I think it's going to accelerate as a consequence of this experience with Trump and the reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, China has got the virus under control. So, political economy. Okay, so let me go back to something else I started talking about, and that is sanctions. Yeah, so this is the report that came out a year ago. I think this is it. So it notes in this report that I think is worth highlighting, President Trump's increased reliance on economic sanctions to solve foreign policy problems is feeling concerned the United States is abusing its financial power and prompting some governments to seek ways to evade American measures. So, and so if China is going to rise further to challenge American hegemony, for good or bad, it's going to have to deal with America's dominance of the global financial system. In recent months, the United States has increased pressure on Iran and Venezuela, dangled the removal of North Korean sanctions, and in only a few days imposed and reversed sanctions against Turkey. And this is becoming more and more a facet of international relations because of the ability to develop nuclear weapons, right? Putting economic sanctions on countries is less immediately dangerous than threatening them with deadly force. Now, American allies and adversaries alike are stepping up efforts to protect themselves in ways that could, over time, erode American power by undermining a key national security tool and diminishing the world's reliance on the dollar as the global reserve currency. So that's the key factor. The dollar is, in effect, de facto, the currency that the world uses for international trade. So if China or the European Union are going to supplant the United States, there has to be the emergence of new forms of international monetary currency that can replace the dollar. In October of last year, Turkey and Russia agreed to a new system for international transactions that would use their local currencies instead of the dollar, which President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia said in October is being employed by the Trump administration as a political weapon. Keep in mind, even though this is a year ago, the pandemic was beginning in China at this time. And then the pandemic exploded in world attention into January and then into February. So the world has paused on these other issues, but it's going to come back in a tremendous rush. Russia has been holding similar talks with Iran and China. Iran has been a focus of sanctions. We already talked about that, about an alternative system that, according to Russian state media, would allow the countries to engage in transactions while evading the arm of United States sanctions. And the European Union moved ahead this year, that's last year, with developing an alternative system that would allow countries to bypass the existing infrastructure for international financial transactions. To circumvent the United States, Trump administration's increasingly use of dollars basis for world economy to put sanctions on Iran. Any country, any bank that does any kind of business with Iran cannot use American dollars, or else the United States will put sanctions on them. And if a company or bank wants to do business with Iran, then they have to have support from the headquarters country where they're based, from the European Union or from China. And that means they have to be willing to face the Americans and confront the Americans as the Americans attempt to punish those companies for doing business, any kind of business with Iran, claiming that they're laundering Iran's as a state supporter of terrorism. No company or business may do business with Iran, and that means they may not use American dollars, because somehow the American dollars end up going through American banks. So for most companies and countries will not therefore do business with Iran, because they don't want to risk the punishment by the American government. They'll only possibly do that if the European Union or their home countries, like the European states or maybe China government, support them against the American government. And Europeans have not been willing to do that, and the Chinese are not willing to take on the Americans in that regard yet. Some of you know about Bitcoin and these cryptocurrencies. It's still debatable about the extent to which those are really alternative currencies. They're still based upon the power of the nation states in regulating the internet. Mr. Trump's scattershot approach to sanctions was on display this week with the visit of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey to the White House. In October, Mr. Trump threatened to destroy Turkey's economy after its military incursion to Serbia. He then withdrew the sanctions after brokering a ceasefire between the Turks and the Kurds in Syria. Now, officials are considering new measures again because of Turkey's purchase of a missile defense system from Russia. So Turkey is using its willingness to pursue better relations with Russia as a means of leverage towards the Americans regarding Turkey's interest and concerns in the Middle East, particularly the Kurds in the Middle East. Trump, they are throwing sanctions at everybody for everything, said Richard Nephew, a scholar at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy and the author of The Art of Sanctions. The administration seems to think that sanctions are a surrogate for foreign policy. It goes on here, Mr. Trump's use of sanctions has far exceeded those of his predecessors, both in scale and the scope of his targets. In 2018, the Trump administration added more than 1,500 individuals and entities to its sanctions list, a total that is 50% more than at any prior year, according to a tally from the law firm Gibson Dunn. Through late October of this year, another 606 sanctions designations have been added. So anybody doing business with those companies, entities or companies or organizations or individuals cannot do business with American banks because they're supporting terrorism. Typically, that's the argument, that they're engaged in terrorism as designated by the U.S. administration, the U.S. State Department. So when the BDS movement is being charged with being anti-Semitic, that means any entity or company that agrees to cooperate in the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement can be threatened with sanctions by the US government. The United States has steadily broadened its use of sanctions since the September 11, 2001 attacks. using its place at the center of the global financial system to stifle the economies of adversaries and disrupt the flow of illicit funds to terrorist organizations, as the Americans decide what's a terrorist organization. Mr. Trump has expanded the punitive measures, targeting them at NATO allies like Turkey, and expanding the use of secondary sanctions against countries and companies that continue to do business with adversaries like Iran, claiming that Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. So experts warn that the administration's haphazard use of tools that freeze assets and cut people in countries off from the world's banking system could undermine the entire program by spawning new workarounds. So sanctions alone will never solve your problem unless they are used in tandem with other tools, said this person, Matthew Levitt, a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. We tend now to be seeing sanctions as the non-kinetic, non-military for everything. In other words, if you're not going to use deadly force, military force, then Americans use sanctions. Over the past year, the European Union has rolled out the instrument in support of trade exchanges, or INSTEX, as an alternative to the SWIFT financial messaging service, which facilitates the majority of international financial transactions. Right, so the Woolry Bank here in the building, they have a SWIFT code number. So I need to have that code number when I want to transfer money to my family in the United States. It would allow European countries, INSTEX would allow European countries to complete transactions with Iran through what is essentially a bartering system. While Europe has said it would use this only for sales of humanitarian goods which are acceptable, the United States has expressed concern the payments vehicles will be used to evade sanctions. So the Trump administration right now, as I'm speaking to you, is putting new sanctions on Iran week after week after week. And for the Europeans to challenge those sanctions, to help the Iranians deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, to deal with the economic consequences, means that you're going to end up fighting the American government. And so everybody's just waiting to see what Biden will do when he comes into office. But again, the Israel lobby has targeted Iran for many, many years. And any Biden administration move to relax sanctions on Iran is going to pay a political price for the Biden administration and the Democratic Party. And that's purposeful by Trump administration. Venezuela and North Korea have also increased their interest in cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, which could be used to circumvent the traditional banking system, according to Peter Harrell, a sanctions expert at the Center for New American Security. And that might be true, but that hasn't developed as much as people thought it might. I mean, if anybody would be searching for full use of these cryptocurrencies, it would be North Korea. But I haven't seen media reports about North Korea engaging in massive exploitation of cryptocurrencies to circumvent American economic sanctions. And Russia has shifted billions of dollars worth of sovereign reserves, which are held in American banks, into gold as a way to reduce the potential effect of additional sanctions. So Russia and Russian businesses have lots and lots of American dollars, and some of them are kept, lots of them are kept in American banks to be used for trade around the world, because the world does business predominantly in dollars. And so there's been this move away from dollars, but with the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis that has generated, the Europeans are not going to take on the Americans right now over these issues regarding sanctions. The question is, are we now reaching the point in which where both our adversaries and our allies will invest in the kinds of tools that will let them fundamentally get out from under our leverage? Mr. Hill said, we are seeing signs they are pursuing these investments. Well, again, this is all before the pandemic started. While Europeans are still working on INSTEX, people recognize this administration as being aggressive and tough on implementation and enforcement of sanctions, and there's nothing they can really do in the short term, Mr. Smith said. They're incredibly frustrated and angry, but they are resigned to waiting this out for the next year to see what happens. So we've seen what happens. Trump lost, Biden will come in, but Every week, the Trump administration is putting new sanctions on Iran. The United States is watching these efforts warily and trying to reinforce alliances to exert pressure on Iran and other adversaries. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin recently embarked on a 10-day, five-country trip across the Middle East and India, where he sought to strengthen the connections with the Gulf nations. So one of the people that they were interviewing who spoke on condition of anonymity described the president's thinking, said Mr. Trump had brought up the idea of sanctions to curb malign behavior because he likes the idea of maximum pressure without firing one shot. But keep in mind, it's not the rich people in Iran, the wealthy and prosperous, that suffer. It's the common people. They're the ones that suffer from these economic sanctions. They're the ones that become further poor and immiserated. It's not the wealthy and the prosperous and the powerful. And so, and this goes on to describe this focus on Iran. And again, just to go back to that article from a couple days ago, highlighting how the US is putting even more pressure on Iran. So, so here's another question for you. Please respond to the following statement. The increasing use of economic sanctions by the United States is further evidence that deadly force is slowly becoming less likely to be a tool in international relations. So let's go back to the screen and the poll and vote. "40 seconds. "30 seconds. "20 seconds. "10 seconds. Okay, and poll and share results. And so you agree. So there's more focus on sanctions, cyber attacks, cyber war. Again, but it's all ultimately a form of sanctions, right? Doing economic damage to other countries, including cyber attacks, malware, disrupting the internet in their home country, in the target country. Okay, so please explain your answer. So let me divide you up into groups of 4. How about in groups of 3? Okay. And Park Ho-ryong, Antoine Jumel, and Yarno Frischeldon, you are the chairs. So come up with the explanation as to why you think that, I think that's the screen, that the increasing use of economic sanctions is further evidence that deadly force is slowly becoming less likely to be a tool in international relations. So please explain your answer. So you're into 3 groups. So you are, Park Ho-ryong, you are the chair of your group because you're at the top there. And Antoine Jumel, you're chair of your group. And Yarno, you're chair of your group. So prepare a statement, prepare an explanation. Why do you think? Why do we see the world changing in such a way that we're moving more to economic and cyber world, cyber attacks, competing in terms of vaccines? Who's got the best economic model? Who's got the best political economic model for development? Who's most effective in dealing with the coronavirus? Who's most effective in providing global leadership in responding to climate change while much of the world is still so terribly poor? Now they've got to deal with climate change as a tremendous new burden upon their development needs. Now they have to deal with pandemics and climate change disasters. Why is that happening? Come up with a statement.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
No, not you, Jarno.
Yarno, where are you, Yarno? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you. My microphone was unmuted.
Okay, talk.
Yeah.
Professor, we're
Yes.
kind of confused if we're on the side of pro or con.
You
Yeah.
decide. There's no pro or con. I just asked for an explanation as to why you think the use of economic sanctions is slowly becoming, is slowly replacing military force in international affairs.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
봐도 되고
음.
그 글로벌 밸류 체인이라 그래가지고
음.
그
네.
그 it means to
Yeah, we already discussed what we're gonna say.
Okay. Okay, so Yarno, group 3, Yarno, what did your group come up with as an explanation as to what's going on?
Sorry?
Yarno, group 3. Yarno.
Yeah, I couldn't unmute myself.
Okay.
Yeah, so we talked about the fact that a lot of like world powers now have nuclear weapons, and that the result of an international conflict could be potentially devastating, and that it would be a better idea to not let it escalate to a level that we can't control it anymore. So that's why we thought that using sanctions as a way of enforcement is a better idea than to use deadly force.
Yeah, even though of course it causes much more suffering for many more people than dropping a few bombs on a building, or it causes mass suffering to millions of people, right? When the economy is damaged, right?
Yeah,
So it's
exactly.
kind of tragic. Do you think? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, in a sad way, it's also like more effective that way, because it reaches further than simply dropping a bomb would. So I feel like that's why it's more provocative to use sanctions, because people take action way quicker when you use sanctions in that way.
It's provocative, but it doesn't work. I mean, if you're trying to change the government of a country, economic sanctions, I mean, as I mentioned, it's not changed the regime in Cuba in 60 years. It's not changed the regime in North Korea. Mm-hmm. It's not changed the regime in Iran. I mean, it's not very political. It's satisfying. It responds to a stereotype that these people are criminal. These are criminal states. These are rogue states, and we don't see them in their complexity in which millions of human beings live and live their lives. They are guilty of living in a country that is led by a criminal regime, a terrorist regime, a criminal regime, and they are all part of this mafia criminal enterprise, and so they all should be punished. Little kids, little children, little babies are going to suffer from this. They're not going to get their adequate food. They're not going to get medicines. Like what happened in Saddam Hussein's Iraq when they put sanctions on Saddam Hussein's Iraq when he invaded Kuwait. Now, the U.S. under Madeleine Albright and the Clinton administration described the sanctions as putting Saddam Hussein in his box, and Iraq couldn't import most valuable things, and so the estimate were that 500,000 children died in Iraq under the sanctions regime until Saddam Hussein regime was at least 500,000 children died. 2 UN overseers of the sanctions regime resigned in Iraq in protests over the sanctions that were put on Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And he only fell from power when the Americans finally invaded Iraq in 2003.
Yeah.
So it's tragic, one could argue.
Yeah, sure, but I feel like dropping bombs would be like it would just revert into conflict. Ultimately wouldn't really change anything else, because and in the end it would still lead to a conflict. And I feel like when we use forces such as nuclear weapons, the devastation could be just as big as those maybe innocent people that are living in those countries.
Well, sure, with nuclear weapons, but that's why the United States hasn't killed top North Korean commanders. Donald Trump killed. Let me see if I can screen share that document before that I showed you before, right? Trump's ordering of the killing in January of General Qasem Soleimani eliminated one of Israel's most feared adversaries. This is the second most powerful person in Iran. And the Americans used a drone to kill him, killing him in Baghdad, in neighboring Iraq after he arrived there at the airport, and as well as a leader of an Iraqi militia. Do you think the Americans would have done that if Iran had nuclear weapons?
No, definitely not.
Probably not.
No, no, no.
And of course, North Korea knows that, and the whole world knows that. The Americans did that because Iran does not have nuclear weapons.
Hmm.
So, and so the Americans continue to punish these, treat these regimes, I think, as criminal enterprises, and the people living in them are guilty by association. It's a stereotype. It's a stereotyping of these rogue states. It's a term, by the way, that rogue state is not a term that a Republican came up with. It was Anthony Lake under the Clinton administration in the early 1990s, describing these small authoritarian states left over after the Soviet Union collapsed, that Anthony Lake described as seeing a threat to from the Washington Consensus and the democratization and economic opening of the world. These are rogue states, like Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Fidel Castro in Cuba, and Kim Il Sung in Kim Jong Il at the time in North Korea, and it's intensified under Trump. That we're going to squeeze them so hard that the people will rise up, but it never works. I mean, in Venezuela, you see millions of people fled the country. In Venezuela to go before the pandemic, to go to neighboring countries to find some way to make a living, to survive, to thrive, and still Maduro is still in power. But why are the Americans doing it? I think it's because of domestic. It's primarily because of domestic drives among sections of the American society, diaspora people, whether it be Venezuelan diaspora, Jewish diaspora, that want the American government to respond to their demands, and the American government does because the American government wants to win political support domestically and win elections. Jumel, Antoine, what did your group come up with? Antoine. Antoine. Where's Antoine? Unmute, Antoine, unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because you mute me. So yeah, and you say something interesting because when we look at how we cannot change the regime of a country, for example, the Maduro regime, it's because the foreign policy making must be approved by, for example, the United Nations, you know, and it's very difficult. And in fact, why the USA prefer to use the economic sanction, it's because the USA can do that, you know, unilaterally, and it's more simple. Okay, the effect is not very powerful, less than send the army, but it's easy to put it in place, and it's why it's a kind of solution for control this kind of country who don't have a democratic regime. Yeah, and in fact, the real problem is that it's very, very difficult to put in place foreign international policy. Yeah.
Yeah, and the European Union, which keep in mind, the European Union is not a nation state, and I think that's really important because I keep focusing on the European Union as a topic of research because, you know, in a sense, I claim, or, you know, from my point of view, one of the main threats or challenges to world peace is nationalism. And America is a nation state and China is a nation state, and but the European Union is not a nation state. So it's less likely to engage in this kind of stereotyping of enemy versus degenerate versus rogue. So here's the Wikipedia entry for instrument in support of trade exchanges. This is INSTEX, that the European Union was developing beginning early last year to try to circumvent the sanctions the Americans were putting on Iran. But I mean, they're not even, when you read the media reports about it, they're not, the Europeans aren't even enthusiastic about it, right? And when you read the report, yeah, it says here, as of January 2020, the mechanism remained unused and irrelevant to EU-Iranian trade. It says here, somebody updated this, on 31 March 2020, during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, the first Instex transaction was conducted. It covered an import of medical equipment to combat the COVID-19 outbreak in Iran. So that's the first time it was implemented. And, but it hasn't done anything else, because the Europeans, if they want to make this work, they have to fight the Americans. The Americans don't want this to work, right? Even though it's not, it's supposed to be a barter system. It doesn't use dollars to be able to do trade. See, it says here is a European special purpose vehicle. Its mission to facilitate non-US dollars and non-SWIFT transactions with Iran to avoid breaking US sanctions. But then they started to try to set it up, but then they didn't use it because they don't want to fight the Americans. Now, so it was used once, so according to this Wikipedia entry. And that's not enough. It's not serious. They're just waiting to see what happened with the US election. Then we'll see what when Biden comes into office. But Trump is making it extremely difficult for Biden politically to change these policies because they have a lot of support among certain sections of American public opinion. We already mentioned the Israel lobby, the supporters of Israel, including the evangelical community, that Biden now is going to undo all of these sanctions that Trump is putting on Iran over the last several weeks and going on to the next year. Politically, it's going to be very, very difficult. There's going to be a lot of hostility and resistance to easing sanctions on this state sponsor of terrorism. As Trump and before Trump, Obama and the Bush administration described Iran that way, officially labeled Iran a state sponsor of terrorism. Ho Young, what did your group come up with? Ho Young. Ho Young. I unmuted you. I didn't mute everybody. Where's Ho Young? I don't know, something's up with this software today, and I don't know. Where's Ho Young? Ho Young! I didn't mute you. Oh. Let me see if I can just a second. I'm trying to do something here. Oh.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, 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 okay. It was my fault.
So we discussed like with the development of war weapons, including nuclear weapons, every country knows the destructive power of war, and there is more loss than benefit by the war. So the armed war is no longer to justify. However, they still want to get hegemony in the international community. So nowadays they more use economic sanctions. Also, the economic sanction is easy to affect to other countries because these days the global value chain has become more common. So we thought it is more efficient to get the dominant position in international relations.
Yeah, I mean, even the Chinese, if the Chinese are going to challenge the United States, the Chinese have to be willing to suffer the loss of access to the American market. And so some people have been predicting that as this conflict between the United States and China intensifies, China is not yet ready economically to try to be a competitor with the United States in the global economy, because its economy is still, it's the second biggest in the world, but they're still relatively, they're not a rich country per capita, per person, when you divide the economy, the size of the economy by 1.3 billion people. So they need to develop further, and they need to focus more on internal consumption issues. But in the long term, that might well be a trend that we see develop. That basically the world will divide into trade blocks. It might have to anyway if the United States under Biden continues to obstruct trade, and if, of course, this is all very complicated because we're still dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and now with the increasing urgency of crises with climate change, human-induced climate change. So the urgency of these problems is so great that if the United States cannot take leadership on this, it might be an opportunity of China to take leadership along with the European Union. The Chinese under their one-party corporatist state in collaboration with the European Union, because as I said, the United States in a sense is depicted by many as going into long-term decline at this time. I mean, like I said, Trump is not going away. He's not disappearing, and he's going to be a dominant actor in the Republican Party. And as the Democrats are always concerned about winning election, there's very strong limits to what they can do to provide leadership now to deal with these global challenges. And particularly when they're continuing to pursue their own their own foreign policy aims and objectives at the expense of the lives and well-being of millions of people in places like Iran and Venezuela and elsewhere. So the turmoil and change in the world international relations that we have been witnessing with Trump is only beginning. I think even when the Trump administration leaves office, the world is going to go through a tremendous number of changes over the next decades. Okay, so thank you, and let me go back to the notes in the time remaining, and let me see if I can find those notes and economic statecraft. Okay, so let me make sure I'm saving, I'm sharing. Screen share. Okay. Close that. Close that. Okay, so the study of the intersection of foreign policy with national security issues is political economy, right? The intersection of governments and markets constitutes the political economy, the political and state regulation of the economy. Regulating commerce is inherently a political process. This textbook that you're using for this class, this textbook was written for American students. Americans come from a tradition highlighted in the textbook itself about viewing economics and business as natural and apolitical, that's somehow part of natural human existence is to engage in the market. And the rest of the world, including Asia and Europe, views it differently. They've long understood that the market is a political tool that the state uses to guide the society to achieve certain objectives, political objectives, including economic development as a political objective. Economic development, not only for the well-being and prosperity of the population of Korea or Japan or France or Germany, but also because of the need to develop power capabilities for the state, to develop and support a strong military. But the fact remains, even in the American case, the state has always played an important role, even if the Americans, because of their political culture, because of their history, are less likely to recognize that. And that's always been true, for example, during the Cold War. I mean, one of the reasons why America is a leader in technology is because of the US Defense Department providing leadership to deal with the Soviet Union and wanting to have a strong military to contain a nuclear-armed evil empire. And again, this COVID-19 pandemic, the US military has played an important role, and is playing an important role in coordinating, collaborating, and cooperating with private sector businesses to coordinate and collaborate and cooperate to organize their efforts to meet this national objective of addressing the pandemic, and now also shifting to dealing with China. So the state, whether the American state or the Korean state, decides what economic system will be in place at any particular time, what the rules of the system will be, like, for example, whether to be more neoliberal or to be more socialist. These are all decisions by state leaders, and how it costs and benefits will be distributed across society, how the economic costs and benefits will be distributed. These are all state government decisions. These issues become a focus of foreign economic policy when other countries are part of the consideration regarding a government's commercial, financial, and regulatory ties. And that's the case particularly when we are all aware about the importance of interdependency, economic interdependency globally, for us to achieve our national objectives, our national policy goals, including the well-being of our people. It constitutes the international political economy, the array of private actors, including small firms, corporations, interest groups, workers, and investors, with which the state engages, along with foreign governments and intergovernmental organizations. So these organizations may include the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. Cooperation is necessary in order for the global economy to function effectively, even while states also engage competitively with each other. So as I said, Biden will attempt to revert back to the policies of the Obama administration, but he's not going to be able to go completely back on what Trump has done politically because of the political obstacles. Establishing the relationships amidst economic actors in the private and public sectors, that means the government sectors, and organizing economic activity within their societies is an essential function of all governments. And again, Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, French, Germans, they say, yeah, of course. And that is true also in the American case, but the Americans were founded by people who rejected state leadership. These Protestant Calvinist dissidents 400 years ago viewed the state as blaspheming God. And so they rejected this notion of the state providing leadership for society. America was founded by people who were locally focused, locally centered in terms of their worldview and their perspectives, not focused upon a strong central state, which they rejected. So the strong central state is still necessary, but the American culture emphasizes the necessity of a military threat to be able to organize these resources. Americans are more able to engage in this kind of government leadership of the society and in the economic area through the political economy if it's seen as necessary to engage in dealing with a military threat, perceived military threat from another country, might be the Soviet Union. And that's the danger, that the Americans are going to look for a new threat from China because they need to have a threat to be able to organize themselves in dealing with the pandemic and climate change. That's my concern, anyway. So political leaders must choose among these different models. The model of political economy a nation adopts will significantly determine the role it plays in the global economy, as well as the broader relations it has to maintain with other governments. So economic liberalism is one model. That's neoliberalism, right? The Washington Consensus. Socialism, I guess that's a focus more on the Soviet Union model, but it depends on how you define socialism. If you're intervening in the market to correct the functions of the market to make it more socially acceptable, that's a very broad definition of socialism, and everybody engages in it. And economic nationalism. These aren't really, these are models in the sense that there are three ideal poles, three ideal types. All governments engage in them to some extent, right? China relies upon the market in allocating resources significantly, but not only the market. State socialist enterprises controlled by the state are very, very important in China, but so is the market. It's also important in the United States. We already described how Boeing Corporation, for example, in the United States, the big maker of airplanes, has a de facto relationship with the Defense Department because of national security concerns. That we need to have a strong aeronautical industry because it's necessary to provide for the American military that secures America and provides benign global hegemony for everyone else, supposedly. And economic nationalism. That means developing your country's resources for your own capabilities. So all countries engage in this, but the Americans tend to blind themselves more than other countries in regard to its reliance on these two other models. Governments typically exploit elements from all three models in managing economic affairs. But the U.S. is associated in its own mind with capitalism, and to view the state with strong suspicion that government intervention in the economy is undesirable. In fact, it should be reduced as much as possible. That has been particularly the case as the years have passed since the Great Depression 90 years ago faded. I mean, the U.S. government intervened in the economy during the Great Depression, but those people who remember the Great Depression, they're all gone now. They're all gone. And you see, until the pandemic, this strong move to try to privatize, neoliberalism. And as the pandemic eventually will pass, now you see American leaders in the Congress talking about reshoring American production capacity so that in the future we don't have to rely upon China to provide vaccines, to provide to provide anything that we might need for our national security. Socialism emphasizes more class conflict, and the Americans don't like to admit that they have class conflict. Communism is the most extreme form of socialism, and I think we might have to stop there. I hope that's it for today. And does anybody have any questions? If not, I'm going to close the room and I will upload the recording of the class to the website. So, bye.